and welcome to another modelling video. This is Alan from the McConaughey at YouTube with another airbrush video. The previous theory on thinners was very popular. Today we're going to do thinning ratios, only focusing on lacquers for now. Let's show the conditions of the experiment and the results.
Just before anybody gets upset, we are not going to find the perfect ratio, as there is none. I'm aware of viscosities, temperatures, conditions, additives and whatnot. We're only going to be using bare basic lacquer thinner and Mr. Hobby lacquer paints. The point of this video is to experiment and find the two extremes of how thick and how thin paint can apply to a surface, how well it sticks to a surface, and what sort of gradients and thicknesses we can get in lines and dusting. I'm also aware that paper is not an ideal surface, as well as spoons or plastic. So the reason why we'll be painting everything across the spectrum only with Mr. Hobby paint. We will figure out the viscosity through drying an age of a jar bottle or pre-mixed paints. The experiment will be done with a low PSI air compressor among 3 airbrushes ranging from 0.2, 0.3, 0.5 mil of different brands and qualities. Conclusion with debunking the theory of consistency of milk. First, we're going to sort out what is the best method in measuring out and mixing our chemical products. Mr. Hobby recommends and retails pipettes, which work well enough up to 10 mil or small hobby jar measurements. They can be disposable, cleanable in bleach. My preference is syringes, especially large volume ones with the pipe. They're dismantleable and can also be cleaned if paint is involved. In the automotive or paint industry, they use large disposable plastic cups with measurements for paint and thinner for the ideal mix in spray guns. I find little medical shot glasses do wonders, and you can buy hundreds to thousands very cheaply to recycle or throw out. The use of all of the above works an absolute treat, especially when you're buying in bulk and thinning it down for prolonged use. I did see recently in social media that scales are being recommended to measure out paint and thinner equally. I find this problematic, as thinner and paint, as demonstrated here, has completely different weights and completely different solids to chemical makeup ratios. This may have been inspired or confused by some resin or powder products being recommended to be measured out in equal parts before being measured. So it's not a tool to completely discard. We're going to measure everything in this video to show the differences regardless. For a balanced experiment, the jar of paint I have used in this video was bought this very week, fresh from a hobby shop. Never opened until this point to prevent any evaporation or drying out. The proper procedure of dealing with it is stirring the inside thoroughly to mix the pigment equally with the binder and thinner. I did notice that it was a little empty, or may have evaporated in prolonged storage. Filled it up with standard lacquer thinner opposed to my normal leveling one, and shook it quite thoroughly. Once opened, I poured it out into one of these medical shot glasses to find it exactly 10 mil. Now this is very interesting. Buying brand new retail from a hobby shop, I didn't get quite what was as per advertised. All weight experiments will occur in these medical 10 mil pointed out jars and zeroed. I started with 10 mil of paint, which gave me 10 grams. 10 mil of thinner, which is far lighter and fluffier, less solids, at a 7 grams. And to my absolute surprise, plain water is also 10 grams. I did not imagine that thinner would be a far lighter substance. Compare with the weight of added pigment and thickening agent such as the binder of resin. My method of finding the consistency or viscosity is swirling the mixture in the medical cup. Solid paint stuck on thickly to the side of the wall and not transparent whatsoever. The more thinner it is, the more transparent and paint runs down the clear glass, making it able to see through. I find that no paint sticking to the wall of the side of the medical cup is far too thin to be airbrushable or to stick onto plastic and adhere efficiently. The first blend is extreme thick, adding 0.5 thinner to 1 part paint, 5mm to 10mm ratio. Looking at the jar, it is transparent enough to be airbrushable. I thought it would splatter or cause issues, but as each of the airbrushes is immaculately well maintained, checked and thoroughly cleaned, there was very little issues spraying it at a low 11 psi. Normally, if you struggle at this stage, you will up the psi to get some sort of coverage. The lines were fairly narrow and okay gradients on freehand airbrushing among the 3 sizes. Colouring in the spoon was very easy for base coating, though I feel it's very thick and probably a waste of paint to do mass coatings in this unless it's a base coat. Not surprising to me at least, the cheapest 0.3mm airbrush I have on hand sprayed just as well as the name branded one. Test 2 is 1:1 ratio thinner to paint. My preference ratio to recommend starting out to get a feel for airbrushing, or an ideal mix for beginners with thicker non-airbrush ready paints. It is a bit transparent, more so than the last mix, but not quite enough to see through completely. The flow was pretty good, and I got a fairly straight, consistent line from the trigger all the way back for a large colour and spray to a very fine line. Gradients were smooth and nice enough. However, still being a bit thick and at the low PSI end, incorrect application, a little evaporation, thickening up or heat, or far enough dry brushing airbrush action can lead to orange peel and other airbrush mishaps and issues. This is where you would thin down further. On the spoon, it's covered quite well for base coating or priming. Test 3, we are doing 2-part thinner to 1-part paint. This is a mix I have used before in the past for gradients, very fine line, detailing and light work. You can see almost through the paint that it's that transparent, however it still sticks to the plastic ever so slightly. In the way of application on paper, incredibly smooth and beautiful to work with, no hiccups, no issues at 11 psi. The gradient is far more smoother with less splattering or issues. You wouldn't get any issues like orange peel or problems of paint buildup or drying before landing. You would, however, start getting in the realm of fisheye or paint sliding off the surface. On the spoon, at a very light mist, it built up on a few layers, though it started to break up and cause the mentioned issue, as there is no primer or thick coat to hold the paint in place on a very smooth plastic surface. Not ideal for base coating. Irritated with the spoon, I got a large gunpla piece that's injection molded and not primed. The paint built up on it in a transparent manner, and each coat filled in the surface equally without flooding detail. Test 4 is going outside what I've personally experienced and pushing the envelope. 3-part thinner to 1-part paint, still transparent, still a bit of paint sticking evenly to the plastic, and you can see through it ever so slightly. On paper, the paint sprayed just as well as the 2-part to 1-part ratio. I found the gradient to still be very smooth and near artistic professional like shading. The wide patterns are far wider than we've got at the last ratio, though you're starting to see the significant differences between the 0.2, 0.3 and 0.5 advantages of doing a fine line and doing a very large spray, which is a bit interesting and not what I've expected in the past. Further experiments will occur on this. The spoon started to break down, pull and fisheye very poorly, and it just did not take on very well. Dusting onto the Gundam leg as you would with a painted or prime piece, the coverage was very even, very nice, didn't pull, it was very light, very transparent, and it was a subtle change from white to a light blue, and it built up. Really good for custom shading. The final, and what I thought would have been the most extreme test and a complete failure to show the end of the flexibility of lacquers, 5-part thinner to 1-part paint, still showed us a level of transparency and the tiniest amount of paint gripping to the plastic evenly, not completely breaking down. In the past, I would assume that this is far too thin to run through an airbrush and cause all sorts of problems. The same story, 0.2, 0.3, 0.5 airbrush nozzle and needle sizes have shown a wider variety of control and intensity. 0.5 is far more thicker in the center, where 0.2 gives a very even spread for dusting on or widespread spraying. The fine lines are equally fine among the three. Very easy to paint on paper. Again with the spoon, broke down and fish-eyed and pulled slightly. I reckon if you just dusted enough paint on to bite, let it dry and put on a base coat, it will build up quite nicely. A lot like building up paint onto the Bandai plastic or a primed surface. Looking into that, it came with a very subtle transparent blue and built up without pulling. Final slap in the face, I got my hands on some full cream milk in Australia, 10ml measurement, which surprisingly weighed an astonishing 11 grams, much heavier than paint or thinner standalone or mixed. Yet, swirling it around doing the consistency test, it does not stick to the side of the walls like paint. It doesn't spray, atomize or stick like paint, leaves a very weird residue in the airbrush. Completely unrelated to airbrushing, an absolute meme and not a useful tool or method to assist with beginners by finding a consistency of milk. All of this was a waste of time for me, as I was reminded by overseas friends that milk consistency differs from country to country in how much water they add or how it's pasteurized and presented from market to market. Just like my Honing Your Airbrush Skills series, I highly recommend everyone to play along in this experiment at home. It is completely flipped airbrushing as I know it on its head, and I believe looking at these results, I'm spraying paint far too thickly, wasting and applying too thick a coats on my models, and that I can have far more control by reducing my paints further and allowing thinner layers to go on top for smoother finishes, less vault, less sanding, less polishing, and achieving either a better matte finish through dusting or a better gloss finish through a wet coat slowly building up. You're just easily able to tell how thick or thin your paint is by swirling it in a disposable jar and how it sticks on the wall. Leaving some of these cups of thinner out, I found that up to half an hour you can lose about a mil of paint in the open air, which was topped up back to the line before being mixed and chucked into the airbrush. Though seeing the transparency level, it gives me an idea how I'm going to be painting from now on, and I'm really liking the 2-part or 3-part thinner to paint ratio from now on, leaning on the 2-part for base coating, 3-part for shading and lines. I've also 100% confirmed and cannot deny that injection molded plastic spoons and injected molded model parts are not the same surface in smoothness, detail and how the paint holds on. Completely confirmed. I will still use spoons that are primed and prepared to a model surface, as it looks good on thumbnails, bit clickbaity, and it's enjoyed on social media by you guys and everyone else. Never again I'm ever going to mention the word consistency of milk or full cream milk. That's completely busted. And starting at 2-part thinner to 1-part paint, I think beginners are going to have such an easier go, especially with cheaper equipment or clogged airbrushes, less well maintained equipment, in spraying and getting a far better finish out of whatever machine or method, siphon fed included, in producing some sort of finish. Thank you very much for watching. As always, until next time, stay tuned for further content, and we'll catch you guys next time. Have a look at the description down below for references and links to all the social media. And if this video does fairly well, or you all make requests in the comment section, I will consider doing the same experiments for acrylic, enamel and polyurethane. See if their thinning tolerances are the same, and in the future, honing your airbrush skills, I may thin even further to see where the true end is of lacquers. Catch you guys next time.